So, welcome everybody to this second in two parts on the IRCF evaluation project. And I want to kick off by acknowledging that Nicole and I are going to be kind of two-upping a bit in this presentation, but I'll probably lead it. And I'm coming to you from beautiful Larrakia country up in Darwin. And Nicole, whereabouts are you?
Hello from Narrigo country, down in Jindabyne.
Great. Okay. And so I'd like to acknowledge the other country that all of you are coming in from today, and also acknowledge any First Nations people who are in the call today. And when we did the session on Tuesday, people were invited to put in the chat the country that they're on. If you've already done that in Tuesday, you don't need to, but if you're new to the call or this session today, then please pop that in the chat just so we can see the spread of country that we've got people from today. That would be terrific. So all of you know Nancy, and I'd also just like to introduce Claire Mannion, who is from VFFF, who's joining us today, which is wonderful. Claire, did you want to just say hello and kind of introduce yourself?
I would, thank you, Sally. It's so lovely to be involved in this circle this morning, the virtual circle. It's really lovely to see you all, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about this part of the program. I am the foundation manager here at VFFF, and some of you may have met David Hardy, who was foundation manager before me, and was quite involved in the development of the IRCF back in 2019. So I thought maybe I should start with just giving you a little bit of a background as to why VFFF is really passionate about building rural community futures. And I think when I was reflecting on this, it really comes back to our admiration for the way that FRRR really authentically engages in smaller rural and regional communities around Australia, and the attention that they pay to not only their successful applicants, but to those organisations who are not able to secure funding from FRRR. And I think the trend that they were seeing is that a high percentage of these unsuccessful grant applications were focused on organisational resourcing and capacity building, which really triggered the conversation about how we can reach those organisations and build a place-based approach to supporting rural and regional communities. So this was really aligned, or values aligned, with VFFF. That's the way we like to support organisations and conduct our philanthropic practices here at VFFF. And look, over the nearly 5 years that we've walked alongside of FRRR in this program, and the three communities involved in this particular program, we've learned a lot. And we have continually incorporated these learnings into our practices supporting other rural and regional communities. So I just wanted to say thank you from VFFF. Thanks for your commitment, and I look forward to hearing sort of the stories of deep impact and how these efforts will be sustained in each of your communities going forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Claire. That's really valuable and a really great kind of big picture to have in our head as we kind of step through the outcomes from the evaluation. So let's get into it. And so this is session 2, and we're going to look at a few different things in this, and I'm going to show a couple of slides just to start with. For those of you who were in the session on Tuesday, where we looked at evaluation in terms of, how to do it and design, we used the IRCF as really the case study in a way. So just by way of introduction into the outcomes, here we are today looking at a sort of a deep dive into outcomes, and we're also going to have a look at some of the recommendations that we made from the evaluation, and a few other things and observations. And while we're going to focus on the VFFF IRCF pilot. As you probably know, we've also been doing the evaluation for IRCF on the South Coast in New South Wales, and there has been some interesting common links across all of the communities, which we thought were important to also share in terms of IRCF sort of overall. So we'll touch on a bit of that. We're not going to do breakout groups or anything in this session, but we're definitely at the end, we're very keen to look at, so now how might you use the outcomes from this evaluation to further continue your own capacity building and growth. So please, we're keen to be able to have a discussion at the end there. Okay, so again, same as we looked at on Tuesday, this evaluation, the theory of change, was developed by another group called Good Wolf. So that was the first step. Then we worked with FRRR to develop the monitoring and evaluation framework and plan. And then this pilot has certainly run over that whole time, but we have, implemented that plan across a few different IRCF locations. So Junee, Leeton and Nambucca, and then down in the Shoalhaven and Bay and Basin, and then some work in the Bega Valley, Glen Innes and Taree. So you're familiar with this, which is the theory of change. And I just wanted to just put this slide up because when we get to the outcomes, one of the primary things we needed to kind of make an assessment on was how successful was the IRCF model in being able to build collaborative, resilient and sustainable rural and regional and remote communities by providing flexible support and funding to local non-for-profits that allow them to, advocate effectively for themselves. So that proposition and this model, which is on the screen, is really what we were looking at testing and then looking at the outcomes from this model being implemented, if that all makes sense. So you would remember from the evaluation that a key part of the theory of change that we really dug into in the evaluation was there in the second circle where we talk about looking at funding and interventions programs dedicated to strengthening non-for-profit systems, efficiencies, strategy and people. Those were the 4 drivers that we then started using the language of pillars. So IRCF has talked about pillars. And so the people one was around looking at initiatives and strategies that might look at developing, leadership and skill development, whether that was across volunteers. All the examples sort of on the arrows are kind of what people were sort of doing and might relate to in relation to each pillar. So people, strategy, efficiencies, and systems. That's all probably very familiar to you. And so when we looked at the outcomes and also the recommendations, we tried to continue to align it to those 4 pillars of capacity building. Then we had the data collection methods, which you'll be familiar with. So we had the online self-assessment survey, This Friend, which you know and love, which we did online. That's just one screen from it. Then, to be honest, one of the best parts of this project, which was the one-on-one interviews, where we traveled to each of the communities and met with each of you every 6 months. So that's been an absolute kind of highlight. Thanks there to Junee Community Power for, I think, the one and only photo that we got of interviews. Then we also, as you know, did the community workshops and integrated the Harwood Index into those community workshops. And then, as mentioned on Tuesday, we also used this device, which was called External Stakeholder Breakfast, which was about gaining feedback and perspective from people not directly involved in the program, but were very connected to the communities in which the IRCF was being rolled out. And certainly the community workshops and the external stakeholder breakfast, that data collection and those tools were only used in the pilot.
Sally, there's a question in the chat, and thanks so much, Jai, for posting this question, and really encourage others to do the same. If you've got a question, pop it in the chat. The question is, what's the difference between testing the theory of change model and looking at the outcomes from applying the model?
Yeah, so I think, wow, that's a complex question right off the bat. So we were interested in seeing whether if you invested in those specific things in relation to those pillars, whether it did lead to any kind of change. And I suppose the outcomes we were keen to see, we went, yes, it did lead to change, but what were the other things that kind of came from that as a result of that? So there we could see that there was increased capacity, but then what does that actually look like? And what's the detail around that in terms of probably also some flow from that, because we had seen that there was increased capacity in something, but then it led to the next thing and the next thing. And so there were some outcomes that we didn't necessarily expect or we knew were going to happen. So I suppose at a high level, it was around, is that model of using those different interventions and program model, like community facilitator, small incremental kind of grant funding, use of the toolbox, the community roadmap, what impact do those things have? And then really, has that had traction? And then what might be the outcomes from that? If that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Thanks very much. That's great.
Yeah, great.
Sorry, I'm sort of coming down a bit sick, so I won't talk too much.
That's okay. That's okay. That's the chat. So please ask as many questions as you need. So that's really the front end in terms of the design. So the stuff you're interested in is, what did we learn? And sorry, when I have this on, but presenter view, for some reason the photo takes a minute to come to the screen. So I thought we would lead into what did we learn with a beautiful photo taken in the Nambucca Valley, Nambucca Heads region. So the first thing really in relation to, I suppose the other thing I need to say is there was a lot of data from this project and there was, we had multiple forms of data collection, and we've done some analysis on the community workshops. We've done analysis on the external stakeholder breakfast. We've done, there's lots of stuff. But in terms of this presentation, we really wanted to focus on what we thought were the key outcomes. And the key outcomes are what is described in the executive summary. And I think is the key stuff you need to know. And then we've put a few extra things in. So I suppose I just want to say that at the front end, because I know there's a whole lot of other detail that exists as well, but we've selectively chosen the highest level things and the things that we think illustrate change and impact most effectively. So hopefully we've been able to do that. So let's go here. So I suppose the key question is, we were asked to assess that model in the theory of change with that propositional question at the front end. And so in presenting the evaluation, we feel confident in saying that the evaluation confirms that the IRCF model of providing flexible support and funding to for-purpose, non-for-profit organisations leads to more capable, collaborative and resilient organisations which can advocate for themselves effectively. So we have been able to show from the data and the analysis that the model has shown an increase in capacity and capability for the majority of the participating non-for-profits. There were some, I don't know, I mean, maybe 2 or 3 that we can't say that statement for. They certainly engage with the program, but in terms of being able to see an increase in capacity, we couldn't say that in relation to that. But they were definitely in a much smaller group. This statement is correct that for the majority of the organisations, there was an increase in capacity and capability. So I just want to step into the key outcomes now. And so the first one is that what we observed and what we heard in collecting the data was that the non-for-profits which benefited the most from the program embraced the IRCF model design feature of providing incremental and supported growth that was linked to a strategy. So that didn't mean you had to have a strategic plan, because we know that a number of you were actually funded in the course of it to develop your strategic plan, but a number of organisations knew where they wanted to go. They had a bit of an idea around what direction they needed to go in, and whether that was written down or not wasn't overly important at the front end. But what we observed was that those organisations that were able to embrace the idea of applying for one small grant, assessing it, doing it, delivering it, and then the next one, and that would lead to something else, that those organisations started to have a much greater capacity to reach some of the bigger goals. The other thing is that the program appears to work best for small to medium nonprofits, rather than very big nonprofits for whom the incremental growth probably isn't the right match for them. But most of the organisations in the evaluation were small to medium, and that theory held out. Second outcome really relates to this idea of participation in the whole program having the greatest impact. So what we saw was that organisations that engaged in nearly all of the parts of the model and the program seemed to have the greatest benefit. Now, that might seem like, well, of course, but not every organisation had the ability to do that or desire to do that. But the ones that we saw engaged in applying for multiple small grants were engaged with the road mapping process, who accessed the toolbox, who certainly participated in the evaluation all the way through. Those organisations we could kind of track, we're talking about showing organisational change. They certainly also showed a real embracing of an ability to have increased networking and link in with other organisations to lead to more collaboration. And they also started towards the end of the program to articulate a greater sense of hope and confidence in their purpose and their future as an organisation. organisations that might have applied for one grant and just got one grant and then might not have come to any more evaluation sessions or any of the community workshops or the road mapping or made a connection with another organisation, the impact was very minimal for them. These two are two quite, standalone outcomes, but I've just put them on the one slide. What we observed is that non-for-profits who receive support to develop or update their foundational business systems, so that's things like policies and procedures, record keeping systems, internal admin, IT, those organisations seem to show greater progress along achieving some of their longer term goals and their bigger goals. So, for example, one organisation updated and prepared their service delivery policies, which meant their ability to secure and deliver on NDIS contracts was increased, and that therefore increased their ability to improve their revenue. Another organisation was able to update and digitise its record keeping system, which meant that that led to a positive accreditation outcome, which was important, for them and their sustainability and their ability to keep on doing what they do. Another organisation noted that developing their internal business systems, admin and IT systems meant that their readiness to embrace and secure a major philanthropic partner, they could link those two things quite strongly. The other thing that's important to say is the local councils have a key role to play here. And they have a key role to play, particularly in relation to this strengthening business infrastructure. So the evaluation showed that the local regional councils that were able to provide things, whether it was office spaces, auspicing grants. In one case, there's a non-for-profit that actually delivers on a council contract, a council providing insurance coverage or payroll support for the small organisations at establishment phase. That kind of business infrastructure was essential in terms of that foundational support. And over time, those organisations will probably gain capacity to become independent. But that ability for a council to provide that level of support, we heard again and again, and it was different in different organisations, but that was essential partnership. The other thing
can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just wondering, were there other anchor institutions that provided similar support to councils, or was there a particular relationship that councils had or a particular nature to the role that councils could play that was important?
So in one community, a council provided support for multiple organisations, and for some organisations, they provided multiple support to one organisation. So they might have provided the venue, the IT, the payroll of a staff member, auspicing of grants. In other cases, they might have just provided a venue. So I would call the council the anchoring organisation, and then they had multiple relationships, with multiple organisations, including a granting program. But in this sense of business infrastructure, it was that ability to provide that foundational stuff that small initiatives just can't afford or don't have. That was that was certainly the value there. Does that answer your question, or were you asking if there are other anchoring organisations?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was just really interested in. Like, is there something particular about councils, or were there other organisations that did some of those functions? You know, like provided venues or support in some way. So I just wondering whether there were. Yeah.
Look, I would think that. Look, I'm just going to talk about Leeton Connect for a minute. So Leeton Connect was an initiative that kind of was seeded and grounded and grew through this program. But I would anticipate that, and maybe someone from Leeton Connect might add to this, that they will become like an anchoring organisation that has the ability to provide not necessarily, you know, payroll and that sort of thing, but an ability in time to be able to provide some of that support for establishment organisations. I'm just trying to think if there were any other. I mean, I think why councils can do that is because they've got that infrastructure and they're grounded in the community. And I think another key factor there is it's also about the intention and the attitude of the leaders at a council level to go, we think this is important, because there's, like anything like this, there's some risks involved. And so if there is that intent and desire to want to be able to support nonprofits, I think that's a key part of any other entity that might decide to be an anchor. And also there's councils in each community. So I suppose that's why it's significant to talk about councils.
Great, thank you.
Neil, did you want to say something?
Just to share our particular experience with Junee Community Power, and I guess I was pretty well involved with it as the mayor at the time, putting up a mayoral minute to recommend that we form a committee focused on sustainable energy use and that sort of thing. Council backed it. Council put in some seed funding, a couple of $1,000. They provided admin support. They even facilitated the very first meeting to see how much community support there was to do such a thing. So that's how we got started. And then, lo and behold, a couple of years later, along comes FRRR and IRCF and, you know, any other acronyms you need to put together. But, and, you know, that's really bolstered us and pushed us forward. So that's just our little personal experience.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, Neil. I appreciate you kind of sharing that, because I think the support that council can give is there in very small ways, it might seem at first, but in actual fact, it's that first level of confidence building and support, which then leads to the next step and the next step. So I think it's important to name that. And that's kind of in line with, I think, the incremental kind of, you know, thinking in the program as well. So the other thing on this slide that I just wanted to say is, as many of you know, a number of positions were funded in the program, and this has been quite significant. And I think it's important to kind of unpack this a bit. So there were a lot of different roles funded. So there have been managers, coordinators, trainee project officers. There's been subsidies provided for managers so that a manager can focus on developing something that they never have time to get to. And so then someone else does the other bits of their job. There's been grant support officers funded, administration, receptionists, probably plus others that I haven't mentioned there. Those roles not only provide employment at a local level, but there's a whole range of other outcomes. So, for example, we had at least one organisation where a mid-career leader was supported to take a sabbatical so they could re-energise and be able to come back again. While another organisation had 2 trainee project officers who have been supported and grown up in a way that's appropriate to the cultural values of that organisation. So that's about building a future, leaders to meet local needs. In another organisation, there was a grant support officer who was able to really have a significant impact in terms of building awareness around grants and, leveraging funds. We also found that those organisations who were establishment organisations and employed a coordinator were able to transition from being a group of volunteers, a great project with a group of volunteers, into maturing into a much more sustainable organisation who could start to have an impact on their community. So there's several examples of that, and I think that's significant to say.
Can I just underscore that? Nicholas Pius, who happens to be part of this teleconference, was one of those people that were paid to do that. Now Nicholas does this on a voluntary basis, and it's outstanding. The fact that he'll put his hand up and just help fill in a grant application, point people in the direction, even has a finger on the pulse of what's the best grant and has the most chance. So, for Junie, again, has benefited greatly from that program, and thank you, Nicholas.
Yeah, great.
And you also wanted to say something about the grant support officer role?
Yeah, so we had the grant support officer funded in Leeton Connect in Leeton. That was an amazing position. In the time that Jenna was there, a local girl, she secured funding for our next 12 months operation, but she also secured a lot of tiny little grants for equipment, anything we needed. And she held they were little personalised sessions for community organisations. So they booked in for a session and she had a one-on-one with them, and she just upskilled them and helped them with their grants. She didn't write them, but she certainly helped them with them. I think she wrote a couple at the end. She's finished with us because her contract ended and she's had a lot of personal commitments. But she also, a legacy of that, we recently had a grant round, a local grant round, and when we saw the picture in the paper, 70% of those recipients were trained by Leeton Connect.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sue. That's a great outcome to share. And I think that also speaks to, that the role of Leeton Connect, but also that ability in terms of providing some of that, small foundational level support that then builds capacity from there.
Yeah. If I can speak to the same role, having done it, I think the biggest thing that we found in Junie was having someone let the groups know what other funding was available. The biggest problem we had here previously, people found out a week before a grant was closing. Another group would say, hey, we've just applied for this, have you? Well, they had a week to find all the information and put it together. So having someone in that role to keep people well and truly informed before it opened and help them work out what their projects were going to be, so be shovel ready. I think that's what made the difference here in Junie. We went from, last minute notice to actually groups are now planning in advance. They know what grants are coming out. I don't need to send out the newsletter the way I was in the past because they're already doing this themselves now, and it has made a huge difference in the community here.
That's great. Thanks, Nicholas. I'll just go to the next one. And one of the earliest impacts that we started seeing pretty much about halfway through the evaluation was people were reporting this really heightened increased communication and greater sharing of information and ideas between nonprofits. One of the things that was certainly we recorded at the baseline was some people saying that there was a siloing at work in their community where information wasn't shared and people were working in isolation from others and that kind of thing. There was a demonstrated noting that that sense of siloing had dropped away, and that there was increased not only communication with other organisations, but also starting to step into collaboration and working together on applying for grants together or working on projects where, 2 or 3 organisations identified a local need and worked together on that. So I think that sense of increased connectivity within communities continued and only increased towards the end. We also had some examples of, an organisation in Junee contacting an organisation in Nambucca Valley who were operating in a similar sector. And so that started to happen. And so that was a bit exciting. The other thing that's worth noting is that in the September, just before the program was sort of starting to wrap up, there were 6 participants across the cohort who attended the Social Impact in the Regions conference. And when we then followed up with those attendees in the data collection after that, that ability to attend that only strengthened that networking, particularly the networking between the 3 communities, because those people went to that conference and said, oh yes, I spoke to that person in Nambucca, or that person in Junee, they are doing the same thing that we're doing. So I think that that ability to be a cohort that then goes to another networking sort of capacity building initiative, that showed to have real kind of impact for them individually, but also that ability to reach out to other organisations.
Sally, if I can comment on that one too, I think that was one of the biggest strengths of IRCF. Rather than reinventing the wheel all the time, here in Junee, we certainly looked at what the other towns were doing and got a lot of ideas from that. And I know, having spoken to some of the groups in the other regions, they were doing the same thing, looking at what we were doing. So I think that is actually one of the biggest strengths. We're not just looking at what's happening in our own town, we're able to see what was happening in other locations that have similar problems that we were having when we first came into this program. So going forward, IRCF should emphasise that side of it, that the networking opportunities really do make a big difference internally within the towns, and just having a bigger network and seeing what others are doing.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nicholas. The final outcome was this very strong sense that the very nature of the program, the long-term funding model, the role of the community facilitators, the localised nature of the community facilitators, the attention and the care that was shown across the program, communicated this sense of believing in us. And I'll just acknowledge it was Patricia at Cowinda Court in Junee who said there was this sense of, communicated this sense of you believe in us, and a sense that rural communities sometimes get a little bit forgotten. So a number of people commented on that. And I suppose the significance of that is there was a very, tangible sense of hope across the 3 communities. And of course, over the time of the program, we not only, of course, had COVID, but we also had flooding incidents, we had bushfires. And so I think the ability to be able to come through all of those and this sense of belief that these organisations are making a significant impact and are worth investing in and making sustainable was quite a palpable sense that we heard from, all three communities. I think it's also important here. I mean, IRCF is what's called a place-based program. And I think there was quite a strong sense, definitely towards the end, of a sense of kind of what we've termed regional uplift and confidence across the communities. And I think that's very specifically related to the fact that it was place-based, because you could look at a normal funding program where there's a number of organisations who are funded and they have great outcomes. But this was very much a perspective of a regional uplift, not just an individual organisational uplift, which I think is significant. The other thing, as I've just mentioned, but I think it's worth emphasising, is that a key part of the IRCF model is the locally based community facilitator. And while there were, in each community, those roles, some people there was a little bit of changeover in those roles. Regardless of that role has proved to be integral in making this model work. And that sense of understanding local needs and local cultural considerations, and also the real, challenges and values and what is valuable in terms of rural communities. So it was interesting from our perspective because the community facilitator role was always there at the beginning of the model, but how it actually ended up working was truly great. We couldn't anticipate how that actually ended up working and the outcomes from that. We thought in the model at the beginning it might be a good communication device, but it actually became much more than that. So I think that's significant to say. I'm just going to pause there. I think there's a couple of things in the chat perhaps, or would anybody like to ask any questions or make any comment in relation to those outcomes before we touch on a couple of other things?
I'll just quickly recap on what's gone in the chat. So there was a comment there from Monique. Ulladulla definitely called on Nicholas at Junee several times and learnt from them. And from Ruth, we agree completely that the local facilitator was crucial in success of this model. And just a very quick observation from me on that role. I think that it's fair to say that I guess a bit deeper to your point, Sally, that what we expected that role might do and the skills that they might have to start with turned out to be something a bit different towards the end, because they certainly, in each community, they operate a little bit differently depending on the skills of the person. But in, some communities, it took on more of almost like a business development or a, strategic development sort of capacity building role. And certainly I think across the three communities, what we saw was that really critical element of that person being able to bring people together within that community, so that that interconnectedness and connecting organisations so that they could collaborate on a shared project and that. So, beautiful.
Yeah. Great. Any other comments?
Yeah. Does anybody else want to? Thanks, Nicholas. They were a good intermediary between FRRR and us. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, they just really helped us to sort of understand, sort of break down some of the more complex formalities around, especially toolbox funding and other during the grants phase of the IRCF. So that I thought that was, I mean, we definitely leaned heavily on them to kind of explain everything to us. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Let's go to a couple of other things. You will remember that one of the questions that we asked in the one-on-one was, and we started asking this sort of pretty much from the second or third data collection, was, has your involvement in FRRR enabled you to leverage or secure other non-FRRR funding? So it kind of spoke to what's the capacity starting to be built to be able to secure other resources to bring in. And so what we have put together here is, so the total non-FRRR funds that were secured from elsewhere across all three communities came to a total of, $8,744,000. So that's quite significant. Each community secured different levels of funding, and it's important to say a few things about that because there's a range of factors that goes into that. Because we know that there's a number of things, going on. So certainly the paid roles, the paid grant writing officers roles has a key part to play in that. There's no doubt about it. There's also organisations that collaborated, and that ability and confidence to collaborate meant that they prepared funding applications where there were 3 organisations who went in together and were able to secure funds. We also know that there was an increased state of readiness around internal policies or staffing or financial management capacity that meant that when funding such as bushfire funding that became available in the Nambucca region, that organisations were able to secure quite significant amounts of money because they were ready to do that. So there's a number of things that went on there. And I suppose it's important to reflect on, at a high level, there's an economic impact from that $8 million, certainly in terms of local rural communities. There were some jobs that were created. There were a number of contractors employed, and also it supported small businesses in those regional areas. We also started to see, obviously, the groundwork of what sustainability looks like. So in order to be able to secure another funder that then was able to enable you to have multi-year funding, and Sue kind of gave that example before for their experience. We also had an organisation that they received some training in being able to pitch for sponsorship. And so that increased capacity enabled them to secure some money. There was also work that had begun around building fundraising overall capability. So there's a number of things that had led to that $8 million, but then also was able to continue because of that money. And I suppose the stuff that I've just put at the bottom there is really a bit of a flowchart thing, which is with increased staffing capability and skills and stronger stakeholder relationships, that then enables an organisation to be able to secure some larger grants, particularly some infrastructure grants. We also know that organisations who collaborated, and there's a few examples of this across the cohort, where several organisations came together and took a strategic approach towards developing a project that might have then also been a community resource-based project, that then enabled them to secure some multi-year grants. We also know that increased local profile and capacity also enabled an organisation to be able to secure a philanthropic partner and have greater experience in being able to begin conversations with other philanthropic partners. So there's definitely some demonstrated links between that increased capacity in the program and how that then led to the securing of those other funds. I might just pause for a minute there. There might have been something come into the chat.
Just acknowledging there, Nancy has said, as the workshop the other day, the slides will be shared with you. So please don't feel that you need to try and frantically take notes of this. Just some comments in the chat about what a significant amount of money that is, what a great outcome that is, just in dollar terms, but also in capacity building terms, that 8.7, nearly 5 million. Yep.
All right. One of the other questions that we asked was how many people have been able to be employed. And again, we were asking people this question at each of the data collection points. And so I'm just going to share this slide and I'm going to say something to it. You might look at that and go, oh, over a 5-year program, it doesn't see many people. But it's significant to know that some of these roles were those coordinator roles, manager roles, grant-funded roles that were funded through multiple years. And also that a number of these roles are very strategic in nature. So the nature of this wasn't about seeking to employ hundreds of people in the course of this project. That's not what this was about. This was about building the capacity and capability of nonprofits. And there certainly have been a number of people employed. But it was how they were employed and what they were employed on, which is, significant to say. So I just wanted to kind of give that wraparound around that.
And Monique, thanks for your comment there. The physical roadmap itself was a great tool or asset to help apply for funding. So, yeah, right. It's a great example of, one of the components of the project that would have been seen as a planning tool, but that actually became a resource. So, yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to step into some other observations now and also the recommendations that we made in the evaluation. So the first one, and it's great to have Monique in the call here because it became obvious about halfway or 3/4 of the way through that Nicole and I, had the privilege of also doing the evaluation in the Shoalhaven Bay and Basin region. And we were starting to see some common elements, also some other elements that they didn't have in common. But the common things that we could see across the VFFF pilot as well as the South Coast, we thought were worth noting. So without doubt, we were hearing a really strong appetite from non-for-profits across South Coast as well as Junee, Leeton, and Nambucca, a real desire to want to learn about what other communities were doing and their experience of IRCF and the things that they were learning about building their own capacity and what they had done and what they had tried, and a desire to want to have a session like this where everybody kind of, came together and learned there. So that was significant. We heard that across both areas. As we've said, again, we heard that the locally based community facilitator, who also, this is kind of speaks to Nicole's point, brings a a professional skill set in whatever that is, because some community facilitators were had business planning, others had really strong facilitation, others had really strong cultural kind of competencies, and so there were different skill sets across the cohort, but that was common. We also saw again that the program suited best smaller non-for-profits who were able to take advantage of incremental change and applying for smaller grants that then were able to increase capacity that they could use to then apply for the next grant and go up there. The other thing we observed is that, again, the organisations who really were able to take advantage of the program in its entirety were those who had some pre-existing competency, particularly in relation to a manager, or the organisation had some project management skills in it already. That core capability was a really foundational thing that helped people take advantage of things. So I think that's probably important to say. And in some places, organisations where people might have been on the committee or the board, but they had project management experience, and were able to use that to help with their planning. That seemed to be a helpful capability. And I'll just say something about a couple of unexpected outcomes from the evaluation that we sort of reflected on. And I suppose one that, was really great is that when we approached carrying out the data collection, we did approach it with a capacity building approach. We mindfully went, let's try and see if we can support people's ability to learn a bit about evaluation or know how they could use some of the tools in their own setting. We sort of hoped that, but about halfway through, we sort of saw that was happening. So there was like, oh, great. So the example of that was things like a number of you have said to us that you wanted to use or have started using the self-assessment survey in some of your own internal stuff. So in assessing your organisation separate to anything to do with IRCF, which was, really great. And some of you also started talking about, looking at using evaluation on some of your projects. So, yeah, the fact that, we're just always thrilled when every time we'd come back every 6 months, we want to turn up. Like that was terrific.
I think, can I just add to that, Sally? So to build on what was talked about in the session on Tuesday, if you're thinking about, using evaluation as a tool in your organisation, and we hope that you do, when we wrote the questions for that self-assessment framework, we took a strengths-based approach to that. So if you go back and look at the questions, they're all designed they're intended to be from a strengths-based point of view rather than approaching it from a deficit model. So rather than looking at what you didn't have, we're interested in what you did have, what was going on. And so I think when you're designing your own evaluation, it's worth thinking about what's your perspective or your lens on that, because you can take a deficits-based approach or a strengths-based approach, and we very much chose a strengths-based approach. And I think, just to add to what Sally said about, organisations giving us feedback that they were using the tool, one of the common things that we heard was in that feedback was we didn't know there was a scale from sort of 1 to 5, and a lot of times people would say, well, we didn't even know that a 5 existed. We didn't know, because you don't know what you don't know. And so that's what the framework provided, and so that was sort of the feedback that we were getting, and it was we were thrilled to hear that. because it was great to see the tool being used more broadly than just responding to the evaluation questions for the organisation. There was just a couple of questions or comments in the chat. So, Nicholas, you mentioned, I think you were talking about the roadmap, where you said it helped us understand the things we didn't know we needed or wanted to do. And then you're just asking about, is there any possibility of IRCF or Matrix coming back to the communities in 3 to 5 years to see how the NFPs have fared since IRCF support concluded? That's a great question. Thanks for posing that. We will leave that one with Triple R to check it out.
Yep. The other thing that's worth saying is many of the organisations involved, you had not been exposed to philanthropic funding prior to your involvement with FRRR or IRCF. And over the course of the program, we know that people's understanding around the philanthropic sector increased. And we know that the capacity building internally in a number of organisations led to the securing of philanthropic partners separate to FRRR into building other kind of local partnerships and having that relationship with a philanthropic funder. And we know that conference in September also strengthened that. So that was that was sort of an unexpected outcome that we started to see once people's capability was increasing. So I'm just going to go to the recommendations that we made. And what I've done is we organised the recommendations according to the pillars. And I've also pulled out, there were some recommendations that we made to FRRR, which I've put on a separate slide at the end because I think that makes a little bit more sense as we go through. So this was really us having done the evaluation and thinking about, okay, what's next, either in terms of what FRRR might want to reflect on, but also in terms of doing, continuing a version of the model just in your own communities in terms of some of the features and also some of the things that we heard which we thought would continue to build capacity. So in the people space, this connector role, whether it's someone called a community facilitator or whether it's called something else, wouldn't really matter. But there still seems to be this need for the entity that is the connection between the nonprofit organisations. Now, in some settings, there now may be an organisation which has taken on that role, and that's fantastic. So it could be the organisation, it could be an individual person in that organisation, it could be an individual person. But while the program has certainly addressed some of that siloing, which was there at the front end, there still seems to be a need for that communication link in some way and that ability to bring people together from time to time to do that kind of group reflection. And also there was something in the community facilitator role, particularly, which was the neutral entity who didn't have a particular preference either way for organisations, but was purely there to provide that communication and connectivity opportunity. We know that there is always a need for ongoing governance training, but mainly because committees turn over. And we know that a couple of the participants in the program, the organisation actually fell over in the course of the program. And Some of that may have been addressed through some governance support, but in terms of, you know, we worked primarily with the committee and the board of organisations, and so ensuring that they can continue to do their work, have succession, have a next generation of people come in and maintain that sustainability, that will be a core kind of development thing ongoingly, that as committees move and evolve, that they have their kind of governance in place. The other recommendation that we would make is that there's a really strong need for local level leaders to be supported. When we did the community workshops, that came up again and again in terms of supporting young leaders, emerging leaders, mid-range leaders, experienced leaders, particularly ones who might be heading towards burnout. There's a whole lot of different layers of leadership kind of support, and it looks different depending on who you are. And we know that FRRR already does, you know, some leadership work, so that's there. But an ability to support emerging leaders as well as mid-level and existing leaders, not to forget them, I think is key in terms of sustainability. And then the last thing probably in the people space is to say that so we know that communities with high First Nations populations, having an Indigenous community facilitator is absolutely preferred. But what we found was that in communities where you couldn't have that, the skill set that you needed was you needed someone who had the cultural competency and a relevant skill set for that community. That was key. So it's really important to have, if you can, a local Indigenous person. But if you can't, the skill set that community facilitators need is certainly a developed sense of cultural competency. The next recommendation sits within the efficiencies pillar. And this really speaks to the, you know, need to be able to make sure that communities, that not-for-profits have got the skill set to build partnerships or to work collaboratively. So it's not a given skill set that organisations know how to work with others. You might network with them, but the ability to collaborate is actually a particular set of processes and a particular communication method. And I think in terms of, I think one of the things we observed in this is, you know, being able to work with others really helps with leveraging other resources. There's no doubt about that. And your impact is increased. And some organisations naturally were able to work with others well. They already had that skill set. But I suppose it's important to say it's not just a given that organisations know how to work with others. And collaboration is actually different to partnership. And being able to pick up the technical differences between those things is important. Otherwise, it won't happen. The other thing is to say, look, continuing on Neil's comments around, you know, encouraging strong support from the local council is essential, and it will look different in each place. There's not one size fits all, but there's so much capability in the council structure, be it the networking, infrastructure, relationships, ability to auspice a grant. That's amazing. Ability to pick up payroll if you want to go down that path. So councils are such an important local resource, which are actually quite a nice match for that small to non-profit sector. And then the next set of recommendations we made was in relation to strategy. And this is really, strategy is about how do organisations think through problem solving? How do they work innovatively to work on old problems and look at sort of new solutions? And how do they actually continue to take small steps but know what the end looks like and how they might get there in an efficient way? So we know that in the program, a number of nonprofits were able to take advantage of the skills of consultants and contractors, particularly in relation to, strategic planning and looking at business models and providing some financial management kind of strategy stuff. That will be continuing to be able to do that will be key to maximise impact and also bring in skill set that you don't necessarily have. The other thing, and this is also probably partly for FRRR as well as organisations, is it's really important to get a really clear sense of what your capability is at this moment and then building on that. If you attempt something that doesn't align with where your skill set is at this point, then the project may not get up. Now, you guys are all in a very different place than you were 4 years ago. So understanding what capability you've got now and continuing to build on that will be important. So in terms of some recommendations we made to FRRR, and so these were some things that you told us in the course of getting feedback, because if you remember, we asked a question around what's working, what isn't, how would you, da-da-da. So we really tried to synthesize this around, we've made a recommendation that really speaks to making sure that within FRRR that there is a dedicated team member who might work specifically around communications and marketing to do with IRCF, to make sure that the nature of the communication, the mode of the communication, the language that's used, the timing, for some organisations, really ringing up and talking on the phone is the most effective way. Email just doesn't really work. So there's a lot of nuances there. And that in terms of, matching that comms capability to the cohort that we thought was important. In systems, having multiple contact people on a grant application form, Nancy may want to speak to this, and this is not always an easy fix, but we just wanted to be able to say that we heard you when a number of you said, all the communication came to the chair and the chair never looked at their emails and therefore we never got any information. So some of this has probably been addressed to some extent, but it's also just to be able to say, we know that, small nonprofits in particular, there are multiple people involved, but sometimes on a grant application form, there can only be one name. And so working out how to match that business system of a grant application and communication methods to match the life of a non-for-profit and how it's designed is something to consider. And then the other thing was, we think there's real benefit in FRRR being able to engage some of the non-for-profits who have participated in the program to then be able to function as some advocates for the program. And that might just be a marketing exercise in terms of an interview with someone that says, this is how we used it and this is how it was useful. Because in fact, hearing them talk about the program impact, as those of you who have already on this call today, is so much more powerful than us necessarily saying it, because you guys have actually lived and breathed it. So we thought that was useful to say. I'm just going to pause there for a minute before we go on to the last couple of slides.
Yeah, there's been some terrific activity in the chat. So, Monique, thanks for letting us know. Art of hosting was definitely key in the Shoalhaven in building our ability to build strong partnerships for leaders at various levels and for multiple people. So we had a new shared language. And yeah, I think there's been other people who've participated in Art of Hosting who've given really positive feedback. Monique also had a question. So, Sally, in regards to the evaluation, the 6 monthly surveys, but possibly other elements of the evaluation, was the goal to identify increasing capacity and capability, or was the process of evaluation also listening out for gaps and opportunities for support?
Look, primarily it was about looking at the model and does the model have the impact that it was designed to do? And what was that impact? That's probably, first of all, what it was. I think we started to recognise some of the gaps. We picked up on some of those things. And in the detail of the report, we talk a little bit about a few bits of limitation and that sort of thing. That wasn't a driver in it, but we certainly recognised that in terms of that just kind of came up in terms of the feedback people gave on the program. So we heard some of those gaps, but it wasn't the driver of the evaluation.
Yeah, and I think too, it's fair to say that the community facilitators from each community came along to, say, the community workshop and the stakeholder breakfast. So they were hearing other elements and feedback from the evaluation, and that was a really great opportunity for them to hear where the gaps were as well, and what organisations were raising, not only as gaps, but also, part of the community workshops was what are the next steps that need to happen in this community. So there was a bit of a planning sort of element to that. And so that gave organisations opportunities to talk to one another and to share ideas about, what are the most important things in our community, and for community facilitators to hear that. And I'm sure that, there would have been some grant applications that came out of that and would have been fed into the process throughout the life of the project.
I mean, I think it's worth saying here, and I'm going to give a shout out to Nancy, because she has been a consistent figure through this whole project in 2 different roles, which I think was really valuable for us, because Nancy started as a community facilitator and then she took over as the program manager. So we knew what she knew, which was very, very helpful. But also, I think one of the qualities here, and I think sometimes in some of the reporting, I've called this, there's been really great, what you might call an action research approach, where there's been feedback given, that's been reflected on and acted on. And that has happened continuously across a few different areas. And not all grant programs have that. as an internal kind of capability. So, and I think, Nancy has been exceptional at that in terms of listening to things and then adapting. And I think that's part of why, the program, some things were added to the program as time went on. The program wasn't designed in its 100% form at the front, and that was the program we've got now. Things actually changed in the course of it. And I think that partly reflects receiving feedback and acting on that. Yeah, I don't know, Nancy, if you wanted to add anything to that dynamic.
No, I think you've captured it in terms of the evolution of the program and once again highlighting that relationships were central between not-for-profits and those pathways of learning were constant between us and then back into the not-for-profit sector. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yep. And Deb, thanks, Deb, for your comment there about people should keep an eye out for the storytelling newsletters. Deb said there's some lovely opportunities already underway to draw on the expertise and advocacy of NFP leaders, and we'll be sharing more about this in the storytelling newsletters.
Right.
And there was, sorry.
Sorry, you go.
I was just going to check in. There was just a question from Jay, just about the how does efficiencies relate to collaboration? What types of efficiencies is the pillar working towards? And was there any consideration about how efficiencies relate to resilience and the value of redundancies? I'm not sure whether to add to that at all, but...
Yeah, I've added a couple of notes there, Jai. I guess they were the original ideas that we were working to, but your comment on redundancies is an interesting one. And I think it's interesting around things that might not have actually solidified within the 5 years. But I think when I was reflecting on that redundancies piece, something that there has been increased thinking around umbrella boards. So just noting, multiple leaders in communities across multiple organisations. And so there's definitely started to be thinking in that place, but that is quite a complex piece of work that necessarily been navigated within 5 years. So I think that's probably the closest we got to that value of redundancies piece. I just wanted to speak to that briefly.
Thanks.
Thank you. And apologies for mispronouncing your name.
Hey,
thank you.
We're almost out of time, but I didn't want to forget this sort of next section, which is about how can this evaluation, these findings, these outcomes help your organisation. So some of the things that occur to us is it can help inform development of your own strategy and your own strategic plan in terms of things that you might put in place internally, either through learning from what other organisations did, but also just, the role of using key people in a particular way. For example, developing a body of policy work that might then enable a grant to be secured or a certain program to be secured. So I would imagine there's some there. And then there's also what we reflected on Tuesday, which is using it as evidence to support grant application requests in any of those areas, particularly ones around demonstrating support to employ certain staff or staff roles, and also funding to support collaboration. I think that's an important one. And hopefully there's also a deepening of your understanding of what are the components that go into developing the capacity of not-for-profits. But I'm certainly keen to ask you how, you might be able to use some of these findings in terms of your own organisational development.
And you're welcome to pop anything in the chat if that's easier for you and I can share it. Thank you for the gratitude being shared by some of you. It's much appreciated. We've enjoyed this project immensely.
I think an example that just presented for me briefly, Sally, I guess to support that thinking for the group, the support of councils has been mentioned quite a bit in this chat. But I guess moving forward for IRCF, of course, there is at times risk aversion, and that evidence, I think, in terms of trying to balance the risk to the potential outcome of that support for different anchor organisations. I think that's something, I just started to think as you raised that piece around councils.
Right.
I think if I'm thinking about Lead and Connect, if we're going for grants to fund our coordinator and other staff to support the rest of the not-for-profit sector in Leeton, I mean, the work we've done previously, obviously, that supports our case that we are a strong partner and that we're a reliable, grantee. So I think that extends into the stuff, all the activities we've done with you as well. So that's a part of what gives us that those credentials, I guess.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nicholas.
And that's really specific to us because we are intending to be the organisation that develops those capacities and kind of, I guess, takes on your legacy. So it may not apply in the exact same way to other organisations who have more specific, missions, but certainly for us, it's relevant.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And look, maybe just the very sort of last slide is more of a general one, which is, not the questions, but anyone, I suppose, in terms of what you might have found valuable from being involved in the evaluation, just as a final point of reflection.
And thanks to the Mudjagunma team for sharing. You've preempted this. You said our evaluation experience always left us feeling like we were doing well and encouraged us to keep up our work.
Yeah, great.
I thought that the evaluations, what I really liked about them is that they connected us back with the other organisations because we're all such busy people. So actually hearing how everyone else is going was really good.
Yeah, great.
I also think the fact that the groups did a lot of self-reflection during the evaluations. Normally, we didn't take the time to do that. You forced us to do it every 6 months, and it showed the areas where we're growing. It showed the areas that just as importantly, the areas that we needed to improve upon. I think that self-evaluation, even ignoring what it's done for the IRCF program, I think that was another core part of the program, just looking internally. And again, come back to the statement I made earlier, we didn't know the things we didn't know, and the evaluations helped us look at that.
Yeah, great, Nicholas.
I think Lead and Connect here, I think for us, or for me personally, it always spurred me into action because I'd see it was evaluation time and I'd get out our list of duties we had to do, and then it'd prompt me to get everyone organised to get stuck into all those boxes we had to tick. So it really prompted us into action.
Yeah, right.
I'm happy to add something. I wrote lots of little notes along the way. I found even early in the week and today really valuable and something we hadn't focused specifically on and like revisited. And it feels like it's one of those areas that we could it was okay to think about evaluation at different points, not just the beginning, the middle and towards the end, whereas at the moment we kind of do it at the beginning and end. So thank you very much. I think that feels like a lovely skill and a way we can support lots of organisations going forward. And I asked the question about the evaluation because I realised that we sort of do little service calls and they're like evaluations and we're kind of listening out for ideas rather than maybe stopping and thinking in more so in your approach that you've taken in this evaluation. So it really wasn't a critical, it was like, oh, we're potentially coming at from different perspectives, and maybe we should spend more time making as a gift to people, so they're feeling more, oh, look where we've come, and that appreciate in that sense, and just always listening out for solutions and what's needed to solve the problem. And yeah, the other one was sorry, I started to write and then it became too hard. Oh, and I just feel like as connector organisations, there's lots that are emerging. So in the findings, that idea around the support that you can give at the first level to build confidence of groups that are establishing or build confidence in their new ideas, I think was really interesting to hear about how valuable that was, because hopefully we can all perform that role in the future.
I mean, I think one of the qualities of the cohort is that we had a varying group. So we had some that were, new initiatives, or groups that had never had organisational form before. They were really a group of volunteers who were doing wonderful work and then transitioning into an organisation, where others were at a different life cycle. So I think the ability for IRCF to have value across multiple life cycles, I think that's a strength. I think it doesn't necessarily go into the big non-for-profits, as we'd already mentioned, but I think for the from establishment, small to medium is kind of its sweet spot. Yeah. Is there anybody else before we wrap up? No.
Will you, Sally, are you going to touch on the VFF impact report? I guess that's probably the only piece.
Yeah, I mean, so we thought there might be a question from someone who says, can we get a copy of the evaluation? And so, always risk management. So at the moment, the evaluation, which is, many, many pages and lots of detail, is going to, at the moment, it'll remain with FRRR, but what will be the outward facing document will be what's called the impact report, which Nancy and crew are working on, and that will have the outcomes, and it will be based around the evaluation report, but we'll have other things in it as well, and then that will become available publicly.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's I guess there were other reflective mechanisms. There was the mid-term review where people were also interviewed, etc. There's the evaluation, there's the roadmaps, there's all the reporting that you did from your granting, etc. So there's a whole lot of content that will be, I guess, synthesised in that impact report.
Yeah, right. Okay, look, let's wrap up. We're over time, but I did also just specifically want to thank Deb and Nancy. Don't think we've got Carolyn on the call. If you're on the call, Carolyn, thank you to you too. But yeah, particularly, Nancy and Deb for your just continual support through this process. It's been really terrific and really valuable, and you're an amazing asset for the organisation. So thank you. And also thank you to my colleague, Nicole. We really enjoyed doing this work, and we miss our 6 monthly visits. So it's been great to come back and kind of present some of these high level things, and welcome any questions at any time. So thank you everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks everyone.
All right.
Thanks,
See ya.
Sally.
Bye. See you later.